Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Megan. Thanks all of you for joining us today live from Glasgow, and thanks to the conference organizers for inviting us to present on, as Megan said, the preservation practices of the Data Curation Network members. So I'm Mikala, and I have the pleasure of being the director of the Data Curation Network, or the DCN, as you'll hear me refer to it. Before I dive in, I wanted to note that if you want to follow along, these slides have been shared out on the DCN's Twitter, which you can find under the handle WeAreDCN. All right, so this presentation is based on the paper of the titled "We're All Doing the Best We Can with What We've Got," and it was co-authored with Luong of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where iPres will be next year. We can't wait to see you there, and John Petters of Virginia Tech Libraries. But as you'll soon see, this paper is the result of many hands, and we want to take a moment to acknowledge all of our Data Curation Network member collaborators. There are way too many to name here. I liked earlier, I saw a slide where it's just a wall of names, and that's what my slide would have been to say thank you. But we're really grateful for their support and participation in this effort. And Luong was supposed to join me today, but unfortunately was unable to, so I wanted to give her a warm shout out because she also made my very drab slides actually look lovely and engaging. Okay, so we have a pretty quick time together today, and so I wanted to give you a sense of where we're headed. We're going to start with an overview of what the Data Curation Network is, just in case you're not familiar yet. You will be after this presentation. And then we'll talk a little bit about our research project in which we unpacked the preservation practices of Data Curation Network members. We'll conclude by discussing some of the potential future directions that we saw and leave time for discussion. And of course, you can follow up either in person at a break, via email, or our website URL is at the bottom, datacuration.network.org, or again on Twitter at WeAreDCN. Okay, so the Data Curation Network is a community-led network of curators advancing open research by making data more ethical, reusable, and understandable. We currently have 17 partner institutions representing academic organizations, nonprofit data repositories, and funding agencies. The DCN has been active since 2016 and officially launched as a member-funded organization in July 2021. The initial phases of the DCN from 2016 to that 2021 were generously funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Apologies. At the heart of the DCN is a community of data stewards and curation practitioners who share knowledge and time to collaboratively curate data sets, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and advance the data curation profession. Within the network, we work to create opportunities to learn from each other, and we are a platform to share expertise, tools, tips, and tricks for data curation. And if you were at the community session yesterday, I can't remember which one, the Preservation Watch felt kind of similar to this in terms of, connecting over shared challenges. Okay, so some of the things that the DCN provides and facilitates are listed here. I'm not going to read this whole slide, but I wanted to highlight curation, which I'll talk about more in a second. I know I said that before, but I promise I will. And the DCN also serves as a really critical education resource for data curators through workshops and data curation primers, we call them. So these are concise and iterative guides that detail how to curate different data formats or types so that we can learn from one another. And we also are a community of practice that offers interest groups, professional development opportunities, and of course, networking. Okay, so here's what it's our shared curation workflow. It's one of the biggest benefits of the DCN besides our active community of practice. And so we call this our supportive curation at scale. As I'm sure many of you know, institutional and data repositories are seeing increasing deposits from a wide variety of disciplines in ever-changing formats. And it's just more than any one institution could have expertise in alone. And so through the DCN, institutional members can ask for a DCN expert to curate different data sets that might fall outside of their area of expertise. And one thing I love about the DCN is you can proverbially, get a fish and learn to fish. You can have your data set curated for you, or you can work with the DCN member to learn how to curate that data set for future reference, or you can kind of do a combination. But in practice, this is what this workflow looks like. The DCN partner on the left talks to their researcher, appraises and ingests content as appropriate, and then they make a decision of, do we send it to the DCN for support or do we curate it locally? If they send it to the DCN, the coordinator consults the available curators to match based on disciplinary and or format expertise to find an appropriate curator, who then applies our curated steps, which we'll talk about in a second, and sends recommendations back to the local curator, who then closes the loop with the researcher. And we really like to reinforce that librarian / data steward and researcher relationship, because that's so important for creating better data sets the next time around. So as I mentioned, these are our curated steps. I won't spend long here, but I just wanted to mention them because these are our, this is our workflow for how we curate data in the DCN. And it's a set of flexible and yet repeatable steps that our curators use when reviewing data sets. And so this helps to ensure consistency in the DCN so all members know exactly how their data will be curated. But it's also a really useful teaching and demonstration tool. It's helpful to talk to researchers about here's what your data will go through, kind of here's the steps I take. And we found that many of our partner organizations have actually incorporated these steps into their curation practices because they've just been useful and helpful. Okay, so that's a little bit about the DCN, and now I want to tell you about a research project that we recently did. So way back in 2017, the DCN conducted a survey where the initial 6 members compared their research data services and preservation practices. That was more than 5 years ago, and since then we have grown by 11 partners, and so we wanted to repeat this process of really comparing our preservation practices to learn from one another. And so the goals of the research project were twofold. First was to serve as a preliminary assessment and basically a snapshot in time of what our preservation practices were. We thought this would help us identify some key themes as well as key pain points that could be collaboratively addressed by the network, by preservation practitioners, or both. And we also wanted to share out our practices to help others learn from members in the DCN as well as outside. We do a lot of this in the DCN. We call it peer comparing, where we share knowledge to help inform our own work and practices. So what this looked like in practice was some semi-structured interviews. In January to February of 2022, I sat down with 16 representatives. At the time, we had 14 member institutions and 2 future member institutions, so that's where we got that 16 from. To encourage free sharing, the conversations were not recorded. Attendees were sent the questions beforehand, and I took notes on good old-fashioned pen and paper throughout the conversation. Afterwards, I sent them a summary of what I heard, and they were allowed to correct, edit, or redact information, because we made it very clear we planned to share these widely, and so we wanted our participants to be able to share the amount of information they felt most comfortable with. Now, since this was considered an initial kind of exploratory assessment, we allowed really a wide degree of flexibility in what kind of information that participants could share. So we didn't apply any quantitative methods in analyzing the data, as you'll soon see, because the interviews were pretty open-ended, and so participants could take the conversation wherever they felt most comfortable, and it made direct comparisons less accurate. And we did include a detailed appendix of the answers we received from partners in our paper in case you are interested. So let's talk a little bit about the results. So our first question we asked was about the preservation actions currently being taken on research data. And answers fell primarily into 2 categories. So first was not surprisingly, curation. Our curators really do view improving documentation and metadata, reviewing file formats for future preservation and use as preservation activities, as I'm sure you do too. And they also, the second category was at the beginning of the research life cycle, like we heard from Ishwar, the lightning talks. It's about that education early in research projects to help researchers know how to manage their data sets and make them more preservable in the long term. I want to make it very clear this is not to suggest that institutions aren't running fixity checks, because they are. They're, of course, doing fixity checks and have duplications of files. But what resonated with me was our members kind of talked about that, but then landed on these. And these were the areas they were really interested in talking more about. Our second question was about retention or deaccession policies. This is something that I just personally think a lot about. We know that we're getting immense amount of data, and it's only going to increase. And so I wanted to know how member institutions were thinking about potentially deleting content, which I know might sound scary, but how are we going to handle this if we have too much data? Most institutions reported that they are or would like to be preserving content indefinitely. So even if there are stated retention and review policies, the underlying assumption is that the content will be preserved. So these review policies are more understood to provide flexibility so that if institutions need to review, they have this language built in already so that researchers can't say, we didn't know, like, well, we have this review policy. Anyways, at this point, reviewing content is incredibly difficult and expensive and not yet worth the return on investment. So no institutions are reviewing for this, and deaccessioning only came up in the event of ethical or legal concerns. So we also asked about data set size. With the exclusion of the Michael J. Fox Foundation and Dryad, which deal just vast amounts of data, many of the DCN members, namely our academic institutions, reported that their data sets were under 10 terabytes, and in fact, the data sets over 1 terabyte were the outliers. Most fall into that megabyte or gigabyte range. Many respondees also noted that there were often hurdles for researchers to deposit more than a threshold amount of data, something like 5 or 10 gigabytes even, like nothing too large. And this included cost recovery models, as well as technical limitations, like you just can't upload more than 5 gigabytes unless you're using Globus or connecting with the repository. And all institutions reported that data set sizes were increasing, and dealing with big data would likely become a more acute problem. For question 4, we asked about software preservation and if that's preserved along a data set. And we did not define software on purpose. We let respondees kind of go wherever they were interested with it. And what came up in every conversation was the blended code and data submissions. And this poses real problems for reusability. I know I don't need to lecture you on this, but there are real pressing concerns about the longevity of this code, especially with regards to backwards compatibility, dependencies in external libraries, and even vulnerabilities. I did want to note a few of our institutions are participating in or very closely monitoring other software preservation efforts, including the Software Preservation Network and the Emulation as a Service Infrastructure, or EASY, as I'm sure you know, project. But there's not a concerted effort of this among DCM members. Okay, our last question that we asked was about cost recovery. This kind of went hand in hand with that data set size. We're seeing a lot of big data sets. How are our institutions going to fund this, just to be quite frank? And very few of the DCM members are adopting a cost recovery approach to data storage. And for those that are, they noted that the costs only go into effect if the data set is over a certain size or if a researcher crosses a certain threshold per year. And even those that have that statement have even said, like, if the researcher comes to us and they, plan it into a grant, or there's room for discussion, is what they all said. All of the academic members reported that they are also working with researchers in that grant planning phase to try and build in the costs of long-term data storage as early into the process as they can. Okay, so in my last couple of minutes, I want to talk about some opportunities and challenges that we saw. So first, as I'm sure you all agree, is data curation is a critical preservation activity, and our members really truly see it that way. Engaging researchers early in the research life cycle and even in their careers is a key way that librarians, archivists, and data stewards help researchers create content that is more preservable by the time it gets to their repository. And something that really just stood out to me was that though I really focused the conversation on preservation and really foregrounded it that way, every single member brought the conversation back to data reusers, suggesting that preservation is all about access for DCN members, and I'm sure many of you. Some challenges that we see, or potential challenges we see on the horizon. So first was that increasingly complex data set. Software and code poses, especially this blended stuff, poses a lot of challenge, not just for reproducibility and reusability, but I'm even thinking about like licensing and rights. Can we throw a Creative Commons on something that's software and code when code and data when the code might need a different license? It's a real challenge. And then two other opportunities that we saw phrasing challenges and opportunities, is the metadata for long-term, large-scale efforts. Many of our members reported that they wanted to be doing more with like premise and other preservation metadata, but their systems just couldn't automatically generate it. And so they were like, we can't write it by hand. We're already trying to curate as many data sets as we can a week. So anyways, a potential challenge and opportunity. And lastly, this is just something that keeps me up at night, is review and retention policies, or looking at other ways to automate review. I just personally like wake up in a cold sweat thinking about like one day our institution is going to say you have to cut your storage by X%, and we're automatically going to go for the large data sets. And I don't know that that's fair. Maybe it is. We could talk about that more if you want. But I just think we need to be prepared for that day. Anyways, that's a Mikala thing, not a DCN thing. Okay. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I want to talk for a second about some limitations. All studies have limitations, and this one is no exception. This is a really tightly scoped group of folks. They are by no means representative of academic institutions, nonprofit data repositories, and funding organizations. So this is by no means applicable or generalizable. Secondly, we only spoke directly with our data curators. So the invitations were sent to the data curators, and sometimes they might bring in their preservation librarian, but sometimes they didn't. And so it's possible that there's information missing from our study because we didn't have all of the voices at the table. And lastly, these interviews were held one-on-one, which meant that members didn't have a chance to spark off one another or just engage. And so there was a lot of disparity in the way the interviews went. So that is a limitation. But the one thing that I really took away from that was that despite the individual conversations, I think almost every interviewee said something to the effect of, we're all doing the best we can with what we got. And that's really stuck with me because we all want to be doing more. Anyways, okay. The other two concluding points I'd like to leave you with is that research data stewards and preservation practitioners can and should continue to better collaborate. So two things we particularly thought about were understanding which curation activities enhance the value of preserved data sets, and which curation activities directly impact the preservability of data sets. And lastly, preservation is an ongoing process, one that is evolving with new technologies, data formats, tools, and information, but by sharing our current practices and our challenges and identifying opportunities for collaboration, we can, enhance our own capacities and knowledge. And so much like the DCN's approach to curation, by engaging in peer comparisons and other information sharing efforts, we can collaborate to continuously improve our best practices and standards. And I went a little longer than I intended, so I apologize, but thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to my co-authors, Wa and John, who made me feel less crazy when writing this paper. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikala. That was an amazing talk. At this point, I would like to open the room for questions from our audience, and a mic will be coming around to you. And I see one hand over there. And just a reminder to mention your name and where you're coming from. Oh, sorry about that.
Hi, this is Arif from Qatar National Library. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's really informative. So my question, it's just more of a thought really. So I'm trying to understand that how the work of the DCN kind of fits into the wider research project life cycle. I think you kind of alluded to that the good research data curation practices really should begin as early in the research project life cycle as possible. And related to that would be that, because as you can see, there are parallels between the work that the Curation Network is doing and also the Research Data Alliance in terms of research data management practices, planning and stuff. So I'm trying to sort of, understand that if the researchers are already having to understand and perhaps implement a research data management plan, then later on, depending on when they get involved with the DCN, do the conversations become easier? Because they've already had to think about those questions to an extent, or is it the same? Not sure if I've asked the question as clearly as I wanted to, but as I said, it's more of a thought, really. Thanks.
No, that was really good. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to state it back just to make sure I understood, especially that last part where I think you had a really fun thread to pull on was about data management and sharing plans, and how if researchers are creating these early in their research projects, does it make the data easier to curate on the end? And the answer is everyone's favorite, it depends. So data management and sharing plans are wonderful, and they're really helpful for helping researchers think through what kind of data am I creating, but sometimes they can be a little cursory, I guess is the word I want to use, and that by the time you get to the actual sharing and implementation, you actually may have diverged from the plan quite a bit if you haven't been tracking it and following it closely. So that's my initial reaction to you, but there are also really smart people in the room and online that might have other thoughts that anybody's welcome to chime in on. In fact, Sandy in the white blazer who had her hand up might want to chime in on it.
Hi, thanks, Mikala, for singling me. So I'm Sandy Caldrone at the University of Illinois, and full disclosure, we're part of the Data Curation Network. Yes, I do a lot of data management planning consultation, and there is definitely a lot of divergence from the original planning stage and the actual research. So I think it's important that we try to be involved in as many of the steps as possible, not just the early ones, but that takes the relationship building that you mentioned between the professionals at their institutions and then the researchers that they're working with. So a lot of it is just old-fashioned relationship building, really. Yeah. But I actually had another question for you if we have time for another.
I think so, right, Megan?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So one of the things I love about kind of long-form interviews, like what you used for this project, is they sometimes lead to these really memorable moments of insight. So was there any moment that stuck with you that kind of changed the way you think about data?
That's a really good question.
Now I'm putting you on the spot.
You really are. Thanks a lot. I don't think there was any one moment, but the one thing that really stuck with me was just, this is so cheesy, don't hate me, but it was just how passionate everybody got in their conversation. And you could just see we all just care so stinking much about this data, and we want it to be preserved. And so I think that's what stood out to me most. And of course the phrase, we're all doing the best we can with what we got, because it was crazy. I wondered if they all emailed each other to say it, because it was how did you all say this? So, sorry, that's the only answer I have, Sandy.
Thanks. We have a question from online, and then we'll get to Mickey.
So I don't know if this is here we go. This question's from Angela Becking, I think that's how you pronounce it. How does data curation compare to data management and data stewardship? Does the community understand these terms as nearly synonymous, or are there significant differences between the three?
I think that's a great question, and one that we grapple with almost daily. I think good data management includes data curation. Otherwise, you just have overflowing files. And data curation, and just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm defining and using as a review of your files to make sure that you're not missing anything or have anything extraneous. You're looking at the metadata to make sure it's appropriate at both the README level and the record level. You might be transforming files, you might be running code to make sure it works. So that's how I'm defining data curation. And I think that it's part of data stewardship and part of data management, but really teasing these out is a challenge, and it's one that I struggle with almost daily. I'm sorry that's not a better answer, Angela.
Can we pass that microphone over to Mickey, please?
Thank you, Mickey Lindlar, TIB. Thanks for that excellent talk. Couldn't agree more about the thing with research data management and digital preservation needing to collaborate more. And I saw that you used fairness in there when you communicated with research data management. I'm wondering if you also used the trust principles and if you found those useful as a vehicle to communicate digital preservation principles between research data management or research data stewards and digital preservationists.
That is an excellent question, and the short answer is no. We use the CARE principles. So we, in our evaluate step, we've recently changed it to be evaluate for fairness and care. But trust, we haven't yet. That's a really great suggestion. I'm going to steal that, Mickey. I promise to give you credit.
We've got one question there, and you've already got your microphone.
I'm Jana Pinnick from the British Geological Survey and our National Geoscience Data Centre. I really liked your comment about reviewing ingested content is difficult and expensive. And you can imagine that geoscience data is valid almost forever, so indefinite retention. And that with your comment on reusability being important for the researchers. And one problem I've identified is with the comment about the DMPs as well. If funders decide to fund research and they don't review the data management plans and the data sets that researchers are planning to generate or capture, then who is responsible for what is captured and what is offered? And that in the context of reusability. Is that a challenge you've identified as well?
Oh, that is an excellent question. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And it's something we're thinking about a lot in the States right now because our NIH, the National Institutes of Health, someone correct me if that's wrong, but they have a new policy going into effect January 2023 that requires much of their data, their funded researchers' data to be made more available. And so this is like really on the forefront of our mind, like what happens when the researcher diverges from these DMPs and then where does the responsibility of reusability come down? And I'm gonna go back to what Sandy said, and it's all about this like collaborative effort. I don't think it's fair to push the burden onto one or the other, especially because like we're information professionals, it's our job and we're really good at organizing information and describing it, and they're really good at their research, and so if we work together, it's just much more, just a much better for everybody. That's what I got. Thank you for that question.
I have one question back there, and then we'll get to Paul's question, right there in the green seats.
Hi, I'm Patricia Sleeman from United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So thank you for your really interesting talk. I really appreciated it. So we've been working with our data management division. It's become extremely important at UNHCR. But one of the biggest challenges has been developing common terms of reference in terms of definitions. We developed this glossary together that was just unwieldy and massive, and we were looking at different sources for defining things, and this seems to be very, very important. One person's digital curation it's just different terms. So I'm just interested to understand what is your, do you have a glossary? How did you come up with it? Or just terms of reference so that when we work together, we are understanding what we're getting there. But it's been a journey. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. So the DCN, as I mentioned, has been around for about 6 years now. And one of the first things they did was they sat down and they made a glossary of like, what do we mean when we say accessioning? And it's about 50 terms. It's available on our website. And that was absolutely critical for laying the foundation for the community. Because yeah, even among data curators, like Sandy and I might have nuanced definitions of terms, and so this really helps to ground us all, as you were saying, and form that common language. It's a real challenge, and I unfortunately wasn't part of that effort, so I can't give you any more insight into it. I've only been here for about a year, but I'm sorry, that's all I got.
Yeah, it takes a long time.
It takes a long time, yeah, and I've been thinking more about, like, do we need to review and update ours?
Yeah.
Because as I mentioned, it's 6 or 7 years old now, like.
So
yeah.
that's the thing, it needs maintenance and review at times. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you. We're out of time, but if you would like to ask your question,
it's a very quick one.
We'll do a quick transition.
Just trying to understand the landscape when you're working, relating to one of the questions you asked about cost recovery. Mm-hmm. Do your funders allow funding of preservation after the lifetime of a project? And if not, are you using a pay once, keep forever model?
Okay, those were really good questions. So the first part was about if funders allow for preservation of data. And so the language of funders in the US, I'm thinking of like NIH and NEH, National Endowment of the Humanities, they often have language like, grant funds can be used for curation and stewardship of your data. And so it's really about like, what does that mean? That's so many different things. And so it, again, comes down to like forming the relationship with researchers early to get in their budgets so that way we can help to fund the preservation. And whether it's a one-time cost or more of an ongoing cost, primarily from what I heard from our academic institutions was more of a one-time cost, more like one-time upfront, charge of X dollars per gigabyte after a certain threshold. And I think that the reason there wouldn't be an ongoing charge is because researchers are always moving, and so I'd be worried that a collection could be without a funder. Okay, now I get to turn it over to Paul, right?
Yeah, thank you again, Mikala.
Thank you all.
Great discussion.